a massive hello to everyone. Very warm welcome to today's Capco webinar on business analysis and the art of storytelling, as you can see there up on the big screen. So again, massive thank you for joining us, and thank you to David and the IIBA for having us today. This is actually the 7th of our Capco webinars with the IIBA, and we're delighted to be back again for our first session in 2023. So a bit about me very quickly. I'm Johnny Molam. I'm a principal consultant at Capco and part of the extended leadership team here in Capco Scotland. I'm also the partnerships lead in Capco Scotland, working closely with Faye Marcano and Loxie Chan, who are our IIBA partnership relationship managers, with Faye, as you'll have seen on the previous screen, also one of the IIBA UK Scotland branch committee members. Today, I'll be moderating the session, so you'll hear a little bit more from me in the Q&A that David mentioned. But the star of the show today is John Wisner. John is a managing principal who will be delivering today's session. He's part of our business consulting capability and also leads our business analyst and process excellence area. So I'll leave it to him to introduce himself, but let me just say that you're in very safe and experienced hands today. Today we'll be delving into how we take our stakeholders along on a journey as we analyse their processes, requirements, solutions and functionality, and how we can bring together various approaches, techniques and artefacts to ensure that the analysis is well connected and appreciated across the full delivery cycle. And a little bit about Capco for those who don't know us. We are a global management consultancy focused on technology within the financial services, so very much in and around the tech and business change space, and we do a lot of thought leadership within the industry as well. And we've got over 6,000 people globally, approaching 2,000 now in the UK, and more relevantly to this group, we have over 300, as you can see there, in our Scotland office. You'll see on this slide that we've had pretty rapid growth in Scotland over the past years, so it's a very exciting time for Capco as we move into 2023 in the new financial year. From an IIBA perspective, we're gold corporate members and have a very active community of business analysts throughout our global population. It would also be remiss of me not to highlight, after David's previous mention about the BA Life conference in April, that we'll be back on the big screen then with more interesting content on the role of the business analyst in the world of intelligent automation and robotics. So we're very much looking forward to that one too. Just a bit of hygiene to mention, you'll see on your screens that today's session is being recorded. As David mentioned, we're doing Q&A, so you can use that function in Zoom, and we'll do our best to get through as many questions as we can at the end, time permitting. Any that we don't manage to cover, again, will be available on the IIBA website in the past events section. So that's really all from me for now. I'll hand you over to Mr. John Wisner, and we can get into the majority of today's content. Over to you, John.
Okay, thanks, Johnny. So welcome everybody. Thanks again, Johnny, for the introduction. I think you pretty much covered everything, so nothing more to add on myself. So thanks again. As you can see on the agenda before you, today we're going to talk about business analysis and the art of storytelling. Specifically, we're going to talk a little bit about why we tell stories, the rules of storytelling, and then we're going to spend the majority of the time, before we go into our QA later, sharing the story of our analysis approach, and we'll be inviting audience participation through some surveys as we go. Okay. So what I'd like to do first is just start with why we tell stories. So really, as BAs, it's worth recognising that we have a lot of information to share. We share that information with a lot of different stakeholders from different perspectives, often from all over the world and across the businesses in which we operate. The stories that we present as BAs, they introduce our colleagues, the clients, the stakeholders, and the knowledge that we've built up. They're used to introduce the context and the projects in which we work in to involve our stakeholders from the start. Ultimately, they go on to share such things as our findings and our recommendations and our requirements, as well, as we'll certainly come to later. And like all stories, the ones we present as business analysts need to resonate with our stakeholders. And you can see some of the points there that hopefully also will resonate with you when it comes to what we expect from storytelling. Okay. Just moving on to the next slide and talking about the rules of storytelling. So generally, when we think about stories, there's certain rules that apply. And the typical rules of storytelling apply equally and appropriately to business analysis. I'll spare you reading all of these, but if we think about some of the points on here, such as the beginning, the middle, and the end, if we think about specifically the beginning in the first instance, this is an opportunity for us to outline, the scope and the context and the stakeholders that we're getting engaged with. When we think about the middle, it's an opportunity to think about the business in which we're operating, their business process, their current state as an example. It's an opportunity to highlight some of the issues and the requirements that they have before ending and thinking about, well, what are the solutions, the features that they need, the benefits that they could obtain from some of the changes that we and they are proposing. Okay. It's a good opportunity as we talk about the analysis approach as well to use our analysis and use the outcomes of analysis to share the insights gained from our various stakeholders that we're engaging with, and sharing their experiences is definitely a large part of that. Certainly to bring to life and bring to colour the situation, to really emphasise some of the key points. It's always appropriate to make sure that the stakeholders' view is brought forward rather than it appear that the BA is making things up, as it were. Right? And ultimately, we use a number of different techniques, as we're about to show you in a moment, to knit together a whole range of topics and findings and concepts in order to produce a cohesive, interesting a story to our stakeholders, to our sponsors, and to others involved in our projects and our analysis. Okay, so I'd like to start actually by just asking a question to the audience, and that is really what stories do you tell as business analysts? So I'd like to give you a little while to populate the poll, if you would. Excellent. So we can start to see your view on the types of stories being told as BAs. So probably no surprise that one of the top items there is around what are the requirements, what are the priorities, and that's definitely something I would agree with, and we'll talk about that in more detail. Interesting as well that some of those other things that I would equally value as some of our higher priority stories to tell, such as what is our current and target state process, what is the scope, and what are our opportunities to improve. Interesting to see that we're all in agreement in that front. So thank you very much for that. And the purpose and what we'll do over the next few minutes is actually start to look at some of those aspects as well. Okay, so thank you for your time for populating that poll. If I move on and start thinking about now what stories we tell as business analysts, really, as we can see on screen, there are a number of stories we tell. Importantly, it's an opportunity for us as the BA to share with our stakeholders and take them through a journey with us. For example, to highlight what is the initiative, what is the vision of the project that we're working on, why is it there, why the requirements are what they are, when, where, and how, as other stories that we might also present. Okay. This is also an opportunity as well as we talk about the analysis. We focus on some of those analysis outcomes ultimately to make sure that as we do that, there's a focus on business value and positive outcomes. Always trying to identify the most beneficial outcomes and findings that we can and present them in a logical manner. Okay, and shortly we'll start to look at some of those phases as we bring together our BA story. Okay. So I'm going to share the approach of actually how of our story, the story of our analysis approach, effectively. Okay, and I'm going to start with looking at the context and the proposed approach. So this is an opportunity for us to ensure that our stakeholders are aware of what the project vision is, what the scope of the project is, to make sure that we're sort of starting on a firm footing of having understanding and that we all know what it is we're required to do and what the aims of the project are. Okay, such things as the project initiation documents, problem statements, business cases, and any existing plans are often a useful input into that. And these are things that that we will look for in the first instance to give us that context and that understanding of what is to be achieved. Okay, we also need to recognise that that unless we have stakeholders to work with, we'll be at risk of making things up. So therefore, the stakeholders, identifying the stakeholders, engaging the stakeholders is a very, very key activity that we do from the start. But equally, stakeholders are a focus throughout our engagement and through the various phases that I'll present to you. Stakeholders are very much at the centre of our mindset. You know, thinking about who it is we should engage, what their perspectives are, the relative merits of some perspectives in certain instances, making sure we're giving a voice to those on the line and those that are responsible for the roles and activities themselves. Okay, we understand therefore as we engage with our stakeholders, their role, their position in the organisation, their area of interest, and who we can escalate to, or even those stakeholders that we need to keep informed. Okay. And likewise, we mustn't forget their location. So certainly, an organisation like Capco, we're engaging with a lot of stakeholders from around the world. Having an appreciation where our stakeholders are based means that we're scheduling meetings and sessions at a time that is actually palatable and acceptable for those stakeholders that are not in the same location as our own. Okay. In order to bring all our our view of the stakeholders together, typically we use such techniques as a RACI matrix, or we'll update our view of who our stakeholders are, their responsibilities, or who's responsible for activities we're going to work on, but importantly, who we're consulting with as we go through our analysis and who to keep informed. Okay. I can honestly say the RACI matrix is something that, whilst I created it at the start, becomes my constant companion as we go through the analysis. It's something that generally I have open all the time because I'm engaging with stakeholders on a daily basis. I need to recognise their potentially changing situation, recognise new stakeholders, and sometimes we even recognise where stakeholders maybe are no longer applicable to the analysis. And these are all things to maintain, to legitimise and give credibility to the analysis ultimately. Okay. And as the last point says there, this is a really good opportunity for us to set the tone for our future engagement for the rest of the project. So by starting strong, as it were. Okay. The next phase of our analysis approach is to focus on the problems and the opportunities. Okay, that includes having an appreciation of actually what is the current state process. Now, I think that can often be something that is already available in the organisations we work with. Sometimes there is a view that exists of what the current state process is. So our role as the BA is to go and obtain that view. But quite often we'll also be required to actually define the process in the first instance in order to give a view to all of our stakeholders that we're engaging with of actually what the situation is today. What activities are happening, who is responsible for those activities, the handovers, and the sequence of events. And all of that is really useful and important insight and context that allows us subsequently to build our view of, well, what pain points or issues are there that relate to the process. And having the view of the process enables us to make sure we're taking into account all perspectives, and particularly those that are much relevant to the process. Okay. And I talked about pain points there as well, but we mustn't forget opportunities. When we're talking about the process, trying to identify the pain points and issues to resolve, we always want to know what is currently working very well, or what the stakeholders' view is on what opportunities there are to improve or make things better. Okay, because we certainly, as we move from our current state to our target state, we do not want to disregard all the good things that are happening already. We want to make sure we can carry on doing more of that stuff. It's just the bad things or the inefficient things that we want to remove. So having that view of both pain points and opportunities is particular key. As is a view as well on the controls. Where in that process actually is there opportunity to validate the data and the information and manage any escalations. Because if those sort of things don't exist in the process, then that's always an opportunity for us to improve things going forward, as would be a situation perhaps where there are many manual processes as well. These are things we look out for. Okay, which is also a good and an opportune time for us to think about as we've now got a view of what the processes are. Well, what are the timings? What's the elapsed time for a particular activity? But what's the actual effort in time as well? And as we move on to get a view of what the target state should be or what the improvements are that we're recommending, having that view of the current situation in terms of time and cost, therefore, means that we can inform the business case, if there's one already, or sometimes actually to extend and go into a bit more detail on the business case as appropriate. So it's very much an important area for us to have visibility of throughout. Yeah. So that's the key point, as I said, of establishing the problems and the opportunities. We then go on to think about requirements, sometimes in the form of user stories, as an example, and think about the prioritization of those requirements. I think as BAs, we're often known for requirements and expected to provide the requirements as part of the end goal or outcome of our project. But I think what isn't often appreciated is that in order to provide good quality requirements and a comprehensive set of views, we actually need to engage with many different stakeholders, as we've touched on a moment ago, and we think about who our stakeholders are, but appreciate the different perspectives that those stakeholders provide, so that we can have a rounded view on the situation and the needs and the priorities. We can represent those accordingly. Okay, and then we can use our knowledge of the stakeholders and our knowledge of the process to help validate that the requirements we've gathered are accurate and applicable across the project and across the group. And sometimes we often look for opportunities to see if there are areas where there's benefit beyond maybe the scope of the existing project or beyond the scope of the existing team. Okay. Which of course leads to requirements prioritization, which is something we certainly do as well. And lastly, this is one of our opportunities to start to update our traceability matrix, which will be something that we would definitely have thought about earlier on in the approach when we were thinking about planning our analysis. What is the traceability approach we're going to take to ensure we've got a clear view of how our requirements, as an example, align to scope, how our requirements align to process, the correlation ultimately of things like solutions back to the requirements. So these are all things that we would definitely have thought of before, but now we're in that phase of talking about requirements. We need to make sure that for every requirement we capture, we have a view of the scope and the process that relates to. And actually, and if we do that in a timely manner, which we often do and always do, traceability becomes a fairly simple exercise for us. We approach stakeholders with an understanding of the process and with a knowledge of the scope. So therefore, as they start to share with us their requirements, we can very easily and quickly start to represent what requirements they're giving us and the alignment and correlation to things like scope or to process or to use cases or otherwise. And having defined, got a view of what the solution is, the next thing for us to consider is the functional design and the solution design, and it's an opportunity to engage with a wider technology and IT infrastructure and architecture. Okay, so having defined the process and the target state process, it's an opportunity to consider actually what capabilities do we need in that target state process to be able to actually deliver the benefit and the outcomes that we're looking to do. Okay, so we'll take those capabilities. So as an example, we might think about the capability of managed workflow, of data capture, of reporting, to name some examples. And those capabilities that are required for our stakeholders to successfully conclude their process in the target state, those are capabilities that we need to have a view of and have a view of how they connect, because ultimately it's going to be those capabilities in the form of technology that we're going to be introducing or updating or interfacing. Okay, and it's a really good point as well at this stage. Once we've got that view of the functional architecture, the functional design, and that view, if you like, of that we've got workflow and we've got data capture and we've got reporting, amongst other things, to share that view back with the business, the stakeholders that gave us the requirements. This is an excellent opportunity to share our perspective on what we're appreciating might be needed in the solution based on the requirements we've been told, because the business might be expecting other things, and if they are, it's a perfect opportunity for them to tell us about things that are not currently sitting on our functional design. It's a good opportunity for us to go back and ask them to create a requirement, or for us to define a requirement that legitimizes the need for that each functional component. And it's a perfect opportunity as well to also engage with our architects from technology, so that we can ensure we've got a really good view of what the technical applications are that they're planning on bringing in and designing and implementing, or perhaps procuring, and how they align to what we need. And it's often at this stage that we recognise that maybe there are some components that we weren't aware of. So we need to think about who's going to do the analysis for that, or who's going to do the design for that. But importantly, by having that view of the various things that we're going to be that we need as part of our solution and how they link, that can inform the interfaces that we need to go away and specify and analyse. So we'll certainly do that. Okay. And of course, it's a really good opportunity to bring the team together, to give them awareness of all the moving parts and all the things that need to come together on the solution, and to start to distribute the team so they can focus on different areas and they can bring their own skill set and experience to look at such things that we'll explore in a minute, such as what do the screens look like, what do reports look like, what's the data that we need to capture or maintain. Okay, so I'm going to move on to another question, if I may, at this point. So I'm interested to know your views on how you adapt your analysis approach, as depends on the situation or the stakeholder or the focus of the change that you're involved in. Excellent. So a very clear winner there in terms of what best describes how you, the audience, adapt your analysis approach. As we can see there, it's applying techniques that best suit the situation. So I absolutely agree. Picking the right techniques from our BA tool set or a toolbox, a toolkit, depending on what you call it, and applying them in the right situation. It's recognising, as we'll talk about in a short while, that some techniques might be appropriate if we're thinking about a report or something visual, whereas different techniques might be more appropriate if we're thinking about data, or even thinking about how the organisation is structured. Okay. So I totally would agree with that. Another important thing to recognise on that survey, I think it's probably the second one that we recognise as important, considering the influence that our delivery methodology, e.g. agile or waterfall or hybrid, might have. And again, I would definitely agree with the importance of that point. Very much the way we always approach our analysis is informed by actually the stakeholders and the organisations we work with. So quite often, one of my very early conversations will be with the technology leads, it will be with the architects, to get a view of actually how they manage the change already. What's the inputs into their development, as an example. And if they're entirely agile and they're using tools like Jira to inform their backlog and to inform what they're working on, then certainly it makes sense for me as the business analyst to be aligned to that way of working and to feed in their requirements, and to encourage the business as well to collaborate in that way. Okay, so excellent. So thank you everybody for your participation in that poll. And we'll certainly take those points, and we'll explore some of them, I'm sure, over the next few slides. Okay. So actually, and we'll do that by taking one such example. Okay. So where we are focusing on our analysis, or analysis is focused on user interfaces or screens, or something where there is some sort of something visual for the user to interact with. Okay. Then in those situations, whilst we can and we do apply a whole raft of techniques from our more general toolkit, there's certainly also some other more dedicated or maybe more appropriate techniques that we tend to use as well. Okay. Explicitly, if I think about user interfaces or reports, it's certainly our approach is to think first about some of the high-level requirements and the high-level capabilities needed in if we take a report or a screen. But then before we get into too much detail and start describing them in a very wordy document or over a series of user stories, we actually want to spend time with representatives of the user community, getting their view of actually what this solution looks like or should look like. And we try not to overcomplicate things if we don't have to, particularly as our role as a BA is to try and simplify what is often a complicated situation, a complicated project or business. We want to try and keep things simple, and that definitely applies once again to when we're thinking about the user interface or project or reports or the visual things that we need to deliver upon as BAs. Okay? And if I take that screen example, I will often sit down with the users and if we just think of a blank page, start to think about some of those objects that need to be on our report, on our page. Think about where the user logically sees this information. And think as well, is there any additional features or functionality that they might need? And it's always a good opportunity now as well, as we're talking about what it is the user expects, what they're looking for, what their vision is for the outcome of this visual thing we're talking about, is to get their insight on how they intend to use that solution, because that in itself might provide some excellent insight, as it often does, to inform development of how the business most likely will need to interact and engage with the solutions. Okay? And by all means, as BAs, there's no reason we can't bring the development team and the architects and the user experience team with us. Okay. I think the last thing to think about as well, when we think about user interfaces, we often engage with our clients' branding teams or branding standards teams, and doing so is a really good way for us to leverage some really good design thinking and expertise that is often already in place in the organisations we work with. It also informs us of some of those constraints on the screens and the expectations. So, as an example, the types of fonts at a lower level of detail, but actually, where the organisation would typically expect their headers to always be, the size, the colour of their headers. Would they have any particular constraints as well on the way that some of their user interfaces need to behave? And having that engagement with internal branding, certainly, if those teams exist, is certainly important to be able to understand some of those criteria. But it's also a really good way as well of ensuring even more your view, your perspective from this BA is as credible as possible. And you start engaging the branding team, sometimes that might not be something that your stakeholders or your sponsors or your project managers might have expected, but it's a really good opportunity for you to bring that broader thinking that we always want to do as BAs. Okay. It also is a good opportunity, as the point at the bottom there, is to bring some of these ideas to life, bring to life what this screen might look like, to try and get people behind the idea and the vision in a more tangible way, perhaps, than we've been able to up until this point in the life cycle anyway. Okay. So that's user interfaces and how we think about the user experience. The next consideration for us, and it's not a sequential thing despite what it might show on the diagram, is to also consider data, possibly in interfaces as well. Okay. Now, in a majority of things we do, there is a view of data information, always typically always relevant. Be that the information we need to capture, the information we need to share, the information that individuals rely on, the information that's going to be provided to other teams or regulators or to outside bodies, or the information that is going to need to travel through our systems and through our solutions. Now, before, bearing in mind that often as BAs and consultants, we don't always have a view exactly of how the business is running until we've worked closely with them. And certainly that will be my expectation of many of the IT and delivery teams we partner with. Therefore, it's important to give ourselves the opportunity to go layer by layer and increase our understanding, it's important to be able to use that as an opportunity to validate with a business what we're hearing and appreciate that it's accurate. But it's also a good opportunity as well to take the technology teams on that journey with us. Okay, so as an example, before we get into detail about talking about particular data points or fields, but actually, what is the information objects? What are the information objects that we care about? Okay, for example, we might care that there is information about the customer and how that customer might interact with a transaction, and how that customer might interact with a booking location, or how a customer might interact with a product. So thinking about those high-level data concepts or information objects gives us that ability to think about conceptually, what is our information landscape? How do these things connect? And it's an opportunity to build our understanding of the situation, share and demonstrate our understanding, but also get some really valuable insight from our stakeholders. Okay, and this is sure I might mention it again, but in order to help all these different interactions we're having, provide these opportunities for our stakeholders to share and inform us of extra things they want, or where there's misunderstandings on our part. It's important that as we go through each of these phases that I've spoke to you about, and the ones we're going to go on to see, that we try to share them as appropriately as possible. Make them transparent. They're not a secret. So I always look as early as possible from the first piece of analysis that I'm putting together, my first view of the stakeholders, through to my view of the process, to requirements, to solutions, to try to share that view with my stakeholders. So I might use dedicated Confluence sites, I might use a Teams site, I might use SharePoint, I might use many other ways, but it's important I give access to all those stakeholders I've been engaging with, give them access to the analysis outcomes that I'm producing, so they can appreciate them, and so they can give me a view as well if things need to change. Okay, and that's certainly a pattern that continues as we think about what are our data concepts, our information objects, how does that come together? Then as we take some of those items, like customer, start to think specifically, now we've got the context, what do we actually mean by customer? What information do we actually need to capture? So such things as recognizing a customer might have to have a unique identifier if they don't already. They will probably have a first name or a surname or a middle name or a company name. Thinking about how we can validate that information is also important, and how we can model that information in a logical way, so that not only we as the BAs can understand things, but importantly, so our business counterparts and so our IT counterparts can appreciate all this complex information that we're digesting and be able to do something with it. Okay, so we'll often use things like entity relationship diagrams to think about the information at a high level. We'll then use class diagrams to specifically think about the data, the fields from a business perspective that is needed. And we'll share that with our counterparts in technology, so they can start thinking about the specific fields that are going to be introduced to the solutions. Okay. That is then often accompanied by specifications or dedicated stories to actually quantify and qualify what we really need, really what those attributes might be, the length of the field, the validation rules, how we ensure quality, which of them, where the master or authoritative sources of those data may be. Okay. And thinking about how we can ensure good data quality as we move through the rest of the process and through the solutions. So they're just some of the things that we consider as we go through our analysis journey. And again, thinking then about what's the traceability to tie all this stuff together. Okay. And then some other things that we then go on to naturally think about is actually implementation and collaborating with our IT counterparts, engaging with them, sharing ideas, drilling into some of the solutions, sharing some of the perspectives, helping them figure out the right solutions for the requirements that we've provided, but also helping them collaborate with the right business users as well, bringing them together. And as we do that, try to share transparency with those business users that we're working with, perhaps through some dedicated MI dashboards or other metrics that we can share to show the progress. Maybe burn downs might be an example of that. Okay, and then to ultimately to start thinking about how we can consider and ensure good business adoption. Okay, which takes us into our last phase, which is then, building on that business adoption, which builds upon that technology implementation, how we can not only ensure that the solutions are fit for purpose and embedded within the business successfully, how do we support them with training, how do we support that adoption, how do we support that communication, but also how do we learn as a change team as well, as a BA team and a BA community. And it's a really good opportunity to consider, if we've not been doing that already, different ways we can improve our approaches, the things we've done really well, and share those with our community. So we certainly share those both with our client communities, and we'll share them within our consulting, BA and process practice and capability group as well, because we want others on subsequent projects to benefit from the good things we've done, to be aware of the positive outcomes that we've had, but also the things that have not gone so well or that we could do better, the team to be aware of it so that they don't make the same mistakes we do, hopefully anyway. Okay, and I think that's probably so I think it's probably a good opportunity as well to lastly think about our BA capability. Okay, and not just plugging in experiences into that BA capability, but we go beyond that. We think about how we can deliver training, expertise, and knowledge to help develop the skills and the appreciation, the mindset, and the ability of our entire BA and process workforce based on our experiences, as you see here. Okay, and I think lastly, you'll appreciate as well that having gone through all of this, there's also always an opportunity to present this information in an interesting way. It probably hasn't escaped you that I've used a Pac-Man style process to illustrate what we've some of our stages today. But we often look for interesting, engaging ways for our stakeholders to look at some of the things we're producing, to really be able to empathise with what it is and recognise and just appreciate it. Try and encourage them to take an interest in what it is we're presenting, and try and make it as interesting and as fun as possible. Okay. So I think lastly, a few more questions to end in terms of the points that you're going to take away from today's session. Excellent. So I'm glad, based on the subjects of this session, that the key thing that you're going to take away is emphasising the story when sharing your analysis. I think hopefully just appreciation that there is a story to be told as well is something to recognise. So I'm glad that you've all you're taking that away. I won't, in the interest of time, I won't read through the other items. I'd like to hand over to Johnny for the Q&A. I'd like to thank everybody for your attention in this section.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, John. That was really fascinating content, really quite insightful, and certainly thinking to my time as a business analyst across a number of different industries. There's a lot of commonality and themes there that we can derive, which can be applied across the piece. So we have had a few questions that have come through, John. So I'll start kind of putting those to you. The first that I'd like to put to you, and it's something that I've got a real interest in as well, actually, is probably more of a personal story that you could share with us, actually. So what stories, or a particular story that you can think back to, in your career, that you've told a challenging stakeholder, which has helped to turn them actually into an advocate? So you mentioned some examples before around needing to take stakeholders on that journey with you, perhaps being met initially with some resistance. Is there perhaps something that you could draw on from your experience there?
Yeah, there is. I think probably the predominant example that comes up is actually, a lot of stakeholders I engage with, they will have a view before they've really thought too much maybe about what they need. They'll definitely have a very clear view of what they think the solution should be and what we need to implement. So a lot of what I need to do to influence those stakeholders, not all of them are difficult ones, I should add, is to help them appreciate that whilst they might be 100% accurate in terms of their picking the solutions that they've identified, that we shouldn't skip a key phase in thinking about what it is they actually need, appreciating why they need it, appreciating what their priorities are, and then once we've thought about some of those other aspects I've spoken about already, how we then appraise whether the solutions they're about to implement or are in the process of implementing, if they are accurate ones. And what I tend to find is that where things maybe are a little difficult, where stakeholders might be a bit more wedded to the solution than others, I think bringing together the different stakeholder perspectives that we've already identified and we've already spoken to is a really key way for us not to make the story all about the BA, but to actually make the story about the situation. What is the situation? What is it the business needs? Why do they need it? What are their clients' needs? What's architecture's view? What are the challenges in technology? As a few examples to help influence, hopefully, working on the right solutions.
Mm-hmm. And often, I think bringing that mixture of stakeholders together actually can be really valuable in shaping that story, not only in the initial phases that we've talked about, as we go through the process, but actually when we're replaying the story back to them as well, to ensure that we've got consensus.
Definitely.
And I suppose just on that, John, we've talked a lot around the kind of process and the approach here. For the people on the call, are there any particular tools or methods, approaches that you've applied in the past that you would signpost, which people could perhaps look to after this call for any of their own research?
Yeah. So I think the most fundamental process we use is process flows, but sometimes they're in their basic form, but actually a really good way to start thinking about process and evolving our use of process is to think about some of those more recommended or more mature approaches. So business process modeling notation, or BPMN, is a way of doing process in, I would say, a little bit more of an advanced way, a little bit clearer way to easily call out which of the activities or processes are manual, which of them are systemic, or which of them are entirely user-based or user-based in systems. And there's a few other benefits besides, but I think using a technique like BPMN improves the way that we think about process, gives us a better tool set, and often the clients we work with who have a process excellence capability, they will almost certainly be thinking about BPMN. Now, beyond that, I think the other thing to also recognise is that if we're going through the analysis from a process perspective with the business, when we ultimately start talking about the solutions and the technology, it's important to have techniques that don't mirror each other. So what I mean by that is if we're using business process flows to try and reflect the flow through a system, it can become confusing to some of the business stakeholders who've been used to seeing that in the context of business process and activities. So using something else like a control flow diagram or a hybrid process flow, where it's more about the flow through the different paths we can take, that's certainly a good distinction and probably an easier technique for us to form and build upon.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I know certainly in some of the previous work that I've done and previous sessions that we've run, I think we've talked about it on one of the previous IIBA sessions. Of course, there are other tools, Miro, for example, has been used to great effect to visualize that story, and that tends to be used often, at least in my experience, more for the requirements capture and kind of brainstorming element that can be used to great effect actually for replaying back the vision, the objectives, and the underlying requirements which have been captured throughout the process. So really helpful. Thank you, John.
Definitely.
So another question that's come in from one of the guests is around the level of detail required at certain stages throughout that approach, that kind of journey that we've walked through just now, John, the Pac-Man diagram. So how detailed from your perspective, and I suppose what I'm interested here in as well is particularly if I'm not coming from a technical BA background, and the majority of my experience has been more in functional requirements. How detailed does that solution design and architecture stage need to be, and what kind of guidance would you give if I'm not coming from that experience and background for ensuring that the baseline level of detail is captured if that's not my kind of core knowledge set?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think generally my advice would be to not go to the lowest level of detail that's relevant. Okay, and that's not a cop-out answer. I will explain that in a bit more, but effectively what we don't want to do is go to so much detail that actually the extra detail is not providing any value. So when it comes to process, as an example, thinking about the activities that different teams are responsible for, and how those activities interact with other activities that different teams are responsible for, that's often an appropriate level to get the context and to start building a view of issues and requirements. Whereas going into a lower level to say maybe within a team what individual roles might be performing certain subtasks, that can be unnecessary. Obviously, if the focus of the analysis is to look at that process and look at those team members and look at their interaction, then going to that level of detail would definitely be appropriate. And it's similar for when we think about data or any other concepts. We might just might stop at the information object or a business or a data concept level or a data entity level, and really just it might be appropriate to recognise that we have customers who have trades who have which relate to products, but sometimes it might be relevant to drill into all or even some of them. And that's where having an awareness of what these different objects could be, starting to have a view with the stakeholders of the level of importance and priorities where that can come in, and then having that flexible mindset to be able to drill into things as appropriate. I try not to create myself a sort of a cul-de-sac that I can't go into, so that I can't come back from. So I try to go layer by layer, and as we go through layers and we identify next levels of detail to go into, it's not my decision which we should be going into. It's actually my stakeholders, my colleagues. They're going to help inform what we should be drilling into next. And quite often, as we drill into a little bit of detail on some of those items, it can inform some larger design principles that we can apply across the board.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I think it's probably just also good to mention at this stage that sometimes the techniques that we identify as BAs might be techniques that are unfamiliar to the business, or sometimes even unfamiliar to the technology and vendors that we're working with as well. And I'd always advocate that's not a reason not to use it. I think in the same way that if we have tradesmen around our house to do stuff indoors, we don't try and tell them what tools or techniques they should use, but we can ask them why they're using certain techniques. And I think it's the same for BAs. I think we have to bring our experience together, and maybe not just our own, maybe that of the team as well, figure out the right tools and techniques and approaches to use, and then share that with the client and with the stakeholders, and give them a view of why we're doing it, and take the time to educate them a little bit and give them guidance on why we're using a technique, how to interpret it, the benefits of it. And in my experience, if you take that little bit of time, then certainly they'll appreciate that, and you won't get too many complaints, I would say, and too much pushback to use a technique which is potentially inappropriate.
Mm-hmm. The tradesman example really resonates with me, John. I've made that mistake once in our house, and I won't be making that again. So
everyone does. That's why it resonates.
And it leaves me to say, again, a massive thank you to John for being our host today, to everyone on the call for attending, some fantastic attendance. Just a final reminder that, from a Capco perspective, a lot of the thought leadership that I've mentioned can be found on our website. Please do follow us as well on the various social media platforms. We're very active on LinkedIn. And we look forward to seeing you again at BA Life on the 27th of April.